a warm welcome to the Center for Social Development Studies Political Ecology in Asia Dialogue. My name is Carl Middleton. I'm the director of the CSDS, and today we're honored to invite Professor Ian Baird to share his research with us. So first, please allow me to introduce Ian. Ian is currently a professor of geography in the Department of Geography at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's also director of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His research focuses mainly on mainland Southeast Asia, especially Laos, Thailand, and Northeast Cambodia. He has written on a wide range of themes that relate to rural political ecology, especially in Southeast Asia, but that also connects to other areas such as development studies, post-colonial studies, and also on indigeneity in Southeast Asia. His work is also well known for having addressed the impacts of development on land and rivers, including large hydropower dams and economic land concessions, which is what we'll be covering today. Ian has published many articles, over 100 peer-reviewed journal articles and 40 book chapters. And his most recent book is titled Rise of the Brow: Ethnic Minorities in Northeastern Cambodia During Vietnamese Occupation. Today, our discussion will focus on Ian's research on land concessions in southern Laos and northeast Cambodia, which relates to questions over control and access of land, government strategies and planning towards economic land concessions and commodity exports, the forms of community resistance that have emerged and what consequences, and then also the role of global commodity markets and how they all intersect around land in Laos and Cambodia. So before we begin our discussion with Ian, please allow me to briefly introduce about the Political Ecology in Asia Dialogue series, which is a relatively new initiative of CSDS. We're organizing these dialogues with the objective of trying to encourage rigorous debate through the lens of political ecology about development issues and trends in Southeast Asia, including on the social, economic, and environmental changes that are taking place. We intend to emphasize the analysis both of the deeply embedded challenges, but also the possibilities for transformative ways forward as well. We hope that through this dialogue series, we can find new angles on thinking about development and political ecology in Southeast Asia, and that it will also stimulate discussion among researchers, civil society, public intellectuals, and others that are interested in this topic. So with that brief introduction, again, welcome to Ian, and thank you so much for making time to join us for this dialogue.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. So maybe we can just begin with an overarching question about your research and your observations about plantations, which is, to what extent have plantations been established in southern Laos and northeastern Cambodia? Over what timeframes have they emerged? Who's creating them, and what are their purpose? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So plantations have been around, obviously, in Southeast Asia for quite a long time. And in parts of Cambodia, they began, during the French colonial period. But the plantations that I'm particularly interested in really emerged in the early 2000s, beginning in the early 2000s, when both Cambodia and Laos brought in new land laws that allowed for very large-scale land concessions to be given out to both domestic and foreign companies. And at that time, we saw both countries giving out a large number of these land concessions that were allowed to be up to 10,000 hectares each. And they were given out mainly to Vietnamese and Chinese and Thai companies who were mainly interested in, at that time, rubber plantations, because during that time, the price of rubber latex was expanding. Rubber is a boom crop, and there was a lot of demand for rubber. And so there was a lot of interest in establishing large-scale plantations to develop rubber plantations. So what we saw was, in Laos, we saw, a couple 100,000 hectares of large-scale concessions given out in the early 2000s. And, similarly in northeastern Cambodia as well. But there were also some other large concessions that were related to eucalyptus and some other crops as well, sugar cane and things. But rubber was probably the most important.
Great, thank you so much. So at least what you're focusing on at present is a relatively recent phenomenon. If we look in journals like the Journal of Peasant Studies, we find that a lot of researchers that pick up the themes of political ecology have paid attention to plantations, both in Southeast Asia and also globally. Given, I think that you have a good perspective on the overall directions of this research, I wonder if you could outline a little bit what have been the key themes that have been picked up in political ecology research about plantations, especially in the areas that you're working? And maybe what are some of the important findings that have been generated through the work so far?
Yeah, so there has been a lot of work done. And in fact, this work has been very much popularized by the Journal of Peasant Studies in particular, but also other journals like Development and Change, Journal of Agrarian Change, and others. But what I would say is that the focus really has been on what has become to be known as land grabbing. Some people call it the global land grab, the global land rush, or other terms as well. And really it's been on sort of the disenfranchisement of peasant farmers and other people that use the lands and forests that were taken over by these plantations. So a lot of focus on the ecological impacts of deforestation and other use of chemicals that have contaminated the land and water associated with these plantations. And then the local people that use those lands and forests, a lot of them were swidden cultivators or indigenous peoples, ethnic minorities, were largely forced to give up a large amount of the land that they relied on for their livelihoods. And many of them ended up being displaced. Some of them end up working for the same companies that displaced them. And so there's been a lot of focus on sort of what I would call sort of environmental injustices, both from an ecological and social perspective, and how, as a political ecologist, we've been very concerned with sort of the mobilization of large-scale capital in order to kind of take over these lands unjustly from people who have been using them for a much longer period of time.
Your work is mainly focused on Southeast Asia. I was wondering if in the body of research that's been done so far, are the issues that you've outlined here shared with other regions, or is there anything in particular about plantations in Southeast Asia that seems somewhat unique to the region?
Well, actually, it's not been specifically related to Southeast Asia. In fact, this has been a kind of global issue in various parts of the world. And Southeast Asia is just one of the regions that's been affected by it. Certainly, you can see similar things in Africa. You can see similar things in the Americas, in many parts of the world, actually. And so this is just a part of this larger trend that has occurred with sort of investment in farmland by large-scale capital especially during the financial crisis in 2008. That's when it sort of began. But there were some of these plantations were already emerging before then. So it's complex around the world, but certainly this has been framed within the literature as something that's been happening globally.
Great, thank you so much. So in one of your recent papers in 2019 in the Journal of Agrarian Change, you chose to focus on something that you mentioned was like after the land grab. And in particular, what I found interesting was that you were looking at the challenges that plantation developers face, which is perhaps quite unusual for political ecology research, given that so much of the emphasis tends to be on, as you've mentioned, the environmental and the social issues, and often the environmental injustices that have been related to plantations. So could you explain a little bit on why you chose to focus on this? And in particular, why is it significant to look at after the land grab? And why is it significant to look at plantation developers?
Yeah, so most of the literature, as you mentioned, has been focused on the environmental and social injustices, and my research as well has been focused on that in the past. But the reason I want to focus on this is because through research that I was doing in the field in northeastern Cambodia and southern Laos, what I was finding, what I remember is when these plantations first started being developed, there was immediately concern by many people about these injustices. But there was kind of an assumption, and I think it's a common assumption that happens amongst political ecologists, that the environment and local people are going to be negatively impacted, and the capitalists are going to benefit, and we're going to see, capital accumulation occurring. And we sort of, a lot of people sort of assume that the companies would profit from these injustices. And in fact, many of the governments kind of thought, well, okay, maybe the local people might be negatively impacted, but the government's going to gain revenue and these companies are going to do well. And ultimately, it will be help the macroeconomic situation within these countries. But what we've been seeing actually is something very different. And I started seeing this over and over with different plantations that I was investigating, and that was that a lot of these plantations were having very serious problems that were, really affecting the bottom line, the profit that they're able to make, the capital accumulation that was assumed by all of us critics was actually not materializing. And also, even the revenue for the government from leasing out these lands to these companies was also not being generated as expected, because the companies were doing poorly, and therefore many times they were actually abandoning their plantations or negotiating with the government to not pay their rental fees because they were losing so much money. And so what I realized is that we've been sort of assuming all the time that these companies were doing well, and this is, there's been so much written around the world and Southeast Asia about the problems of these concessions, and yet very few studies have looked at the actual how the companies are actually doing. And I think these plantations have been around long enough now that we can start to assess that. And so what I saw is that many plantations have been abandoned. Many plantations are still there, but they're struggling for all kinds of different reasons. And what we end up with is sort of this idea that maybe it's not just the companies winning and the villagers losing, but maybe it's a kind of a lose-lose-lose situation where the villagers are losing out and the environment's losing out, the government's not getting the benefits they expected, and the companies are also not benefiting as they expected. So what I believe is that if we understand that to be the case, which I think the evidence from my research shows, that becomes a rationale for arguing against these types of plantations, because not only are the villagers and the environment losing out, but even the government and the companies are as well. So who's benefiting from this? It's hard to imagine who is actually benefiting. And that, it's a real shame that so many lives and so much environmental impact has occurred, and actually nobody's really benefited from it. So that's, I think, the crux of what I'm trying to say in my paper.
And this is a topic that we'll come back to a little bit later. I would like to ask a little bit about whether you see this as an emerging transformative moment as this realization starts to occur. But maybe first, I'd like to ask a little bit more about why plantation developers do seem to be having these problems. So partly in your analysis, you draw out the idea of commodity prices and resource frontier mentality. And some of it also quite surprises me in terms of, I always imagined that investors would be relatively savvy, at least to the functionings of the market. But you observe, for example, that investors tend to invest when the market prices seem high, but we also know that these types of commodities like rubber fluctuate, so they get caught out. I wonder if you could expand a bit on this, about why companies don't seem to be more savvy to the way that global markets of commodities work.
Yeah, well, I think, I guess, if you have to go to some investors and say to them, we want to invest in a big plantation. If the price of that commodity is very low at the time you go to those investors, it might be hard to sort of make the case, mathematically, right? I mean, the numbers just don't add up. So it makes sense that companies tend to invest when prices are high, and when it's possible to gain investor support. But of course, as you pointed out, we know that these commodity, especially with boom crops, tend to fluctuate significantly. And so if you invest when prices are high, there's a very good chance that prices will go down later. And I mean, that's exactly what we've seen with rubber. People invested largely before, just before 2011 when prices started to drop, but it takes 6 or 7 years before the trees are large enough to produce latex. So by the time that trees started to produce latex, the price of rubber had gone down very significantly. And this has caused a huge problem in terms of the economic returns that these companies could get from rubber. And really, the price has not recovered up to now. From over the last 10 years, it's been relatively low. So the whole bottom line, the whole business model that was produced on the understanding that prices would be higher has not materialized. So that's been a huge problem. But I think the second part of it is fundamentally linked with this. And this is this idea of resource frontier, right? The idea that you have to get in there quickly. The prices are high now. You've got to get in there before somebody else gets there first. And sort of this imagination of northeastern Cambodia and southern Laos as being, having these sort of undiscovered kind of landscapes that can be converted to plantations very cheaply. And these are, wonderful soils, untouched soils, that you can that you can get. And if you don't get them now, somebody else is going to grab them. And so what results then is that, these companies come in very quickly and they don't do the type of studies that they should, to really figure out whether what they want to do is viable enough. So for example, we see there was a lot of understanding that there were these new hybrids of rubber trees that could be grown anywhere, that you could plant them virtually anywhere and get a good return on them. So people were going to areas, of dry dipterocarp forest with very few trees, very little vegetation, and assuming that they could plant rubber there. And so they did. And of course, most of that rubber has died. I mean, literally, you go to areas that were planted where there's literally no trees left at all. And, it's amazing that these companies didn't do basic soil surveys, and before they actually invested all this money. But it seemed to be the resource frontier mentality that, resulted in them assuming that all this land was pristine and pure and therefore open for investment, and that they would not encounter any problems. And so the combination of rushing with the high commodity price combined with the resource frontier is a very dangerous kind of combination, which results in bad decisions being made in various cases. For example, you had this Birla Lao, this Indian company that invested in eucalyptus. And they got this, 40, 50,000 hectare, concession, and they kind of assumed that it was all land for the taking. But when they went down to the field, they found that actually the villagers were claiming a lot of this land, and they couldn't just take it that easily. They took some of it using rather underhanded methods, but some of it they couldn't get a hold of, and they were only able to get together, 13, 14,000 hectares of the 40, 50,000 hectares that they expected, which means that they didn't have enough land to create the factory that they wanted to be able to process, make paper. That's what their plan was, but they didn't get enough land. So a lot of assumptions about what was possible, and assumptions about Laos being a place where there's no people, it's empty, and there's a lot of empty land that you can just have. In other parts of the world, Birla Lao has invested in plantations, but they've always used contract farming as their method. So trying to work with the people. In those places, they seem to assume that they couldn't just take the land, but they somehow thought that when it came to Laos, they could just take the land and nobody would resist. And obviously that turned out not to be the case.
So this then leads to another important area political ecology research on plantations in Southeast Asia overall, looking at the relationship between the companies, the state, and the communities that often have their land dispossessed. And I guess there's quite a lot of literature that shows power of the state, alliance with the company, kind of bulldozing people out of the way. There's also quite a few examples where there has been successful community resistance of different forms. And I think in the research you've been writing in southern Laos and northeast Cambodia, you kind of paint a nuanced picture of how much they're able to impact, and especially how it relates to the company's bottom lines. So I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on that, like how much agency or how much influence has community activism and maybe civil society activism had towards influencing these companies?
Yeah. So on the one hand, you're right that many times these companies have been able to invest and have managed to get a hold of land through collusion with government at various levels, beginning with the concession agreement, but also at lower levels of government where sometimes they've been given commissions for getting hold of land and using their local government power to displace villagers or to placate people. And so that has happened for sure. But on the other hand, when villagers resist strongly, and when the companies aren't giving the government people what they would like to get, then sometimes the local governments will turn against the companies and support the villagers. Maybe not openly, but implicitly by not doing anything to stop them. And we see this having happened in various cases where I think the Burla Lao example is the best, where the company felt that they didn't have to pay off the local government because they had a concession with the central government. And they were initially able to get a hold of some land, and then they started to run into problems with villager resistance, and the local government wasn't cooperating because they didn't feel that they were getting the benefits, and they were also becoming increasingly sympathetic to the villagers. And so there was sort of a combination of things going on there. And so then Burla Lao went to the central government and said, hey, we have an agreement with you, can you come and solve this problem with the local government? And the central government said, well, you're going to have to solve that problem yourself. I mean, they were unwilling to use their centralized power to override the local government. And I think, so sometimes they are willing to do that, but other cases they were not. And I think it also has to do with a growing kind of level of sympathy that was emerging within Laos at this time, where people started to realize that this wasn't really benefiting local people or the environment or even the government, and that these are just companies out for profit, and they didn't want to, expend their political capital to, support a cause that wasn't really benefiting the country. So, so these companies that were originally supported by the government all of a sudden found themselves not being supported. Now, having said that, some companies, especially those associated with Vietnamese investors, were much more successful in mobilizing that political capital against villagers and received much more government support, and therefore were much more successful in displacing villagers. Other countries, including China, have been much less successful in doing that. Vietnam is really the exception to the rule in terms of their ability to mobilize political capital in an effective way on the ground. But the Chinese, the Indians, the Thais have been much less successful in that regard.
So this is really interesting and important that you emphasize the political context that has the impact on the investment. Mind is that these are agri-businesses that I think essentially kind of see that they are doing modern agriculture in the form of modern plantations. But then you've also documented that they faced a lot of other technical and environmental issues in the way that they've tried to implement their modern agricultural projects like diseases and flooding and so on. That I don't know if it's uncertainty or just things that can't be managed, but do you see that there are challenges that are not fixable by these modern agribusinesses when they try and invest in southern Laos and northeast Cambodia?
Yeah, I think there was an overconfidence in the ability of technology to solve all problems. That they were in some ways arrogant and thought that they could fix anything. And obviously, they've run into very deep problems in many cases, whether it has to do with diseases or rubber trees blowing down due to heavy winds in certain regions. Soil problems. Lots of flooding in some areas. I mean, these are not easy problems to deal with, and they sort of assumed that these new hybrid varieties, and even if they didn't work, they could somehow, use other. They could put more fertilizer in, or they could do other things that would fix those problems. But it hasn't worked out that way, and so the level of there's been a real too high a level of confidence. And too high a level, and I mean, in a similar kind of way, too much of an impression that the governments would protect them from resistance from local people. That's a similar kind of thing, overconfidence in things that were really not as certain as they thought they were.
So I think the overall impression that I get from this analysis is that there are many difficulties that the plantation developers will face. And I think this is also the conclusion of your paper. And as you mentioned at the beginning, it seems that in many ways there's a lose-lose scenario for villagers, government, and investors. And as you mentioned a minute ago, it also seems that government officials themselves, especially at the local level, may be themselves losing confidence or not expressing as much support for land concessions in the past as a route to development. So I'm wondering if we sort of think about what happens next over the next few years. Do you anticipate a decline of plantations as an approach to development in southern Laos and northeast Cambodia, or will they evolve into something else?
So firstly, just to respond to the first part of that question, I think that we as political ecologists need to treat the state in a more nuanced way. We need to think about the state as a more varied, not just as a single body with a single understanding and idea. So that's the first thing that I think is important for getting the type of analysis that will be useful. But to your main question, unfortunately, what we've seen in many cases is even failed plantations. If you look back, let's say in the Bulaban Plateau in southern Laos, the Asia Tech plantation that emerged there back in the 1990s, which was the first major plantation of the sort of post, Indochina War era. They failed. They had plantations of eucalyptus and pine trees, and this plantation failed. And you would have hoped, and there was a lot of villagers that were very unhappy with that land being taken from them. But what happened is that after that plantation failed, rather than returning the land to the local people as they would have liked to have had happen, the government turned around and gave it out as a new concession to a new company. And so I'm a little bit skeptical that the governments will necessarily return this land to the rightful owners. And I'm concerned that they may turn it around and try to repackage this land for other purposes, bringing in other investors or other capital schemes of various types. And so I'm not trying to suggest that the problem is over and that we can sit back and feel that plantations are finished. I don't think that's the case at all. But I do think that what my paper provides is some new evidence that can help in the argument against opening up plantations more in the future, and also in arguing for returning the land that was taken away from villagers already and returning it to them, because actually there is no evidence that or very little evidence that most of these plantations have actually been able to generate much economic value. And maybe the local people would actually be doing a better job. In some cases, productive, small scale plantations that local people had operated before were bulldozed to make way for these larger plantations. And so, I think that it shows that we should be less confident about these large-scale monocrops, and we should recognize their vulnerability to economic fluctuations, to villager resistance, to technical and environmental issues, to markets and prices. I mean, there's a lot of things. And the problem is with these plantations is there's a lot of things that can go wrong. And it only takes one or two of them to cause everything to kind of collapse, or to at least, sort of run along in a very low level way, which is kind of what's happening. Some of the plantations, they're sort of barely holding on, but they haven't abandoned them yet. And they're kind of waiting around hoping that conditions improve. Whether they will or not, who knows?
So this is a very concise analysis of the challenges that both investors and the companies have faced. I wonder if the model itself is perhaps not running out of momentum itself, but maybe reinventing itself. I'm wondering if instead the analysis that you present that shows the very significant economic challenges at a minimum, but also how they relate to the political challenges of plantation establishment, could give insights for ways to transform this thinking on development, if not from the mainstream, at least to give new ideas about how activists or even free-thinking government officials might reapproach plantations and development.
Right. So political ecologists, we're always so skeptical about capital investment, and we tend to want to expose the injustices related to the environment and local people. I mean, that's the main work, the contribution that political ecologists tend to make. But I think there are some limitations to that approach. And while I'm not arguing that we should stop doing that, I think that still remains a very valuable role. I do believe that looking at things from a different approaches, but with the same kind of lens of wanting to see a more just world, wanting to see more fair ways of interacting, but looking at the ways that investors see things and the types of problems that they face may give us some insights into strategies that would be useful for trying to convince decision makers and others, and even investors themselves, that there are certain types of investments that don't serve anyone's purposes. And that is one way in which we can help to reduce the number of injustices that are occurring, is by getting that message out. It's one thing to say villagers are losing out, the environment is losing out. A lot of people will take that seriously, but a lot of other people will say, well, we don't really care that much about that. Some people will say, well, you've got to break an egg to make an omelet. These are necessary casualties in sort of the path of development. But if you look at it and say, well, actually, the investors are losing out as well, and the governments aren't gaining the revenues that they expected either. And so, if your goal is to, develop macroeconomically, which is something that political ecologists are always very skeptical of to begin with. But if that is your goal, which is not our goal, but if that's your goal, what we're showing here is that that there's a lot of problems with that as well, that this is not achieving that goal either. So, if you're looking to do that, maybe you need to look elsewhere.
So this then leads to my final question. This novel research that has really emphasized the developers themselves and the challenges that they faced is not that represented in political ecology research in general. So I wonder if as a final insight that you could share, what would you suggest should be a political ecology research agenda on plantations and land in mainland Southeast Asia? Like, what should be the key priorities, do you think?
Well, I mean, you're right that political ecologists very rarely look at these sort of issues from the perspective of investors. But what I would say is I explicitly did this in my research, but I did it still with the lens of a typical political ecologist. So I'm doing this, but I'm also maintaining my lens, which I'm not advocating that we change, but that we can use that lens in innovative ways that might give us insights into things that we might not otherwise have noticed. So you can look at things from a lot of different angles and potentially see things that you haven't seen before. And that doesn't mean that we have to give up our ideals or the things that we think are important, but that can be done. And that can also be useful both for seeing things in new ways, but also in terms of convincing different audiences that we might not otherwise typically speak to, which of course has been a criticism of political ecology in the past, is sometimes we are not that good at speaking to others who see things in different ways than we do. So maybe this is a way of making that some of the research that we do more accessible to some other groups of people. But I think ultimately sticking to our principles. I mean, we still at the end of the day, we know what we know what we think is important. Values are important, and I'm not suggesting we should abandon those. But I just think that we should, be open to different ways of approaching problems that we've all been very interested in already.
Great. Thank you so much for spending time with us today and sharing on your analysis of plantations in southern Laos and northeast Cambodia. It's been really interesting. And I would say there's so much more to read from the papers that you've produced and your ongoing research. So again, thank you very much for making time to join us. And I hope that you'll join us again in a future session to discuss some of your other work.
Yeah, and thank you for having me. I really enjoyed this discussion as well.
Thanks so much.
Okay.